The book Murjana is quite fascinating because it touches on so many aspects that are each within themselves are, quite intriguing because it has history, it has romance, it has culture and art, it has politics. It even has a dash of religion and sectarian sort of relations and interrelations. The book focuses on quite a mesmerizing time in history, a time when Baghdad was arguably the center of the world from the civilizational point of view, from the cultural perspective. First of all, what was the drive? What was the motivation? Why this?
Very good question. Look, I'm chiefly known as a political activist and writer on Palestine. That's what I've spent my life doing, and that's what people expect to hear about from me. I've published a number of books. They're all about Palestine in one way or another. This was a real aberration for somebody like me. And you might well ask, why did I write this? I thought about this quite a lot. On the superficial level, I remember when I started writing, it was now going back at least 5 years, I had reached a point in my political work where I felt very disheartened, disillusioned, exhausted by the way in which I and people like me were talking about Palestine, writing, demonstrating, picketing, all this. And yet the situation for Palestinians was just getting worse. Yeah. So it was, on the one hand, a sense of exhaustion and disillusionment. A search for, okay, well, what can I think of? Really, I can't think of anything else. So I needed a rest. But secondly, I had in my working life, because I'm a doctor by training, a doctor of medicine, I'd spent quite a few years in my life focusing on medicine, Arabic medicine, طب العربي in Arabic, which was practiced at a particular time during the period of Islamic civilization, and very much so during the period of this book of Murjana. It was at its height, so that a physician practicing at the time would be quite a natural character for a book like this, which indeed it was. And I felt maybe it was time I visited this particular specialization of mine and talked about it. So that was at the superficial level, in answer to your question. But I realized there was a deeper level at why I very much wanted to do this book. First, it's being Palestinian. You might ask, well, what on earth has that got to do with medieval Baghdad? Yeah. The truth is, we Palestinians, our connections with our homeland were brutally cut. So much so that for many of us, there was a loss of continuity, of connection with the Arab world, because so many of us ended up, like me, living in exile in the West. So it was, on the one hand, a need to reconnect with the Arab origins of the Palestinian people. I mean, the Palestinians are Arabs. Yes. And the history of the Arabs is a common history. Correct. So I really was, I think unconsciously, very motivated by that desire to reconnect with my own history, my own legacy, the past. So that was one part of it. But the other part of it, you see, was that I discovered in myself a kind of anger. Anger at Israel and what happened to us is something I've lived with all my life. And I don't mean that. I mean anger at the way that the Arabs have been treated by the colonial West as somehow worthless. We are people without cultural interest, without an impressive history. We're nobody.
No kind of impact on the world as we know it today.
Exactly. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth.
Correct.
And it was like a sort of rejection of that particular view of the Arabs that I felt I wanted to say, you know, you Western powers come and trash Baghdad in 2003.
Yeah.
You behave towards Iraq as if it was nothing, as if it was a rubbish dump. Do you understand what you were destroying? So it was very much again pushed by that passion to show Baghdad as it had been once.
You and I were amongst the throngs, the crowds that demonstrated against the war in Iraq 22, 23 years ago. And you know, as you put it, you're a renowned activist for human rights and freedoms and anti-war against particularly, you know, people who are wronged time and time again from your Palestinian roots. But the question that I have to say I asked myself when I was reading the book, and I have to say it's a beautiful read, it's very difficult to put it down, was why Baghdad? Why not, for instance, Damascus? You could have written about Damascus, which was closer to home. It's within the construct of a sham. It also reflects. So why? What made you choose Baghdad? Was that deliberate, or was it just so happened to be the first thing that you came across?
No, it wasn't. It was deliberate because I am an admirer of the early Abbasid Caliphate. The Umayyads is another story. I mean, they were really they opened the gates to Islamic rule, no question. But by the time of the Abbasid, 750 AD, things had settled down and Islamic rule was more or less established. So there was a space for the flourishing of the arts, of the sciences, philosophy, and all the other aspects of a very great civilization. That really materialized during the Abbasid period.
So would I be correct in saying that this is a work of fiction, but it's very much rooted in something of a truth?
Definitely, definitely. And if people read the book, they'll find the historical note at the end of the novel it explains this. Yes, indeed. Some of the characters, the main characters, are loosely modeled on real people.
Yeah.
And in particular, of course, the Caliph, who is a central character.
Absolutely.
And he's modeled on a man I enormously admire, Al-Ma'mun.
Yes.
This is a great, great man. You know, Plato had this concept, introduced this concept of something called the philosopher king, where you had a ruler, an enlightened ruler, who was also a philosopher. That was an ideal, that Plato talked about. And I think the closest the Arabs got to that was Al-Ma'mun, really.
The character of Murjana, she is, in your novel, she comes from a different sect. You see, I can't help but read and invoke my own consciousness because I hail from Iraq. I was born in Baghdad. In fact, my grandfather's house was in the district of Al-Ma'mun in Baghdad. So I was reading with, it was as though something connected to me was being written. And I have to say that up until the American-British war and invasion against Iraq in 2003, the issue of Sunni Shia was never really an issue. It was never there. But the way in which you painted this relationship, this romance between Abu Mansur and between Murjana, one from a Sunni background, one from a Shi'i background. It's beautifully set. I wonder what you were trying to say. What were you trying to say in that depiction?
Well, look, you're right that the Sunni-Shia split is a modern phenomenon in its accentuated form.
Yeah.
But, you know, the seeds for that were laid a long time ago. And we mustn't forget that with the appearance of the Persian Empire, which became a Shia empire, and then the appearance of the Ottomans, who were Sunnis.
Yes.
So there was, for centuries, there was this, at first subterranean divide, but it flared up from time to time. We cannot deny it. And today, even today, you know, enemies of the Palestinians keep talking about Iran-backed Hamas or Iran-backed Hezbollah. What is that about? It's about a Shia state, Iran, which is backing Shia small groups. Hamas is not a Shia group.
Right.
Nevertheless, if it's the moment it's supported by Iran, you then get this. So it evokes something in people. And that's indeed why I already introduced that, because I traced it back historically to that time exactly of Al-Ma'mun.
Yes.
It was very small in those days, but it was beginning.
And Murjana as the character, Murjana, the name is quite telling, and the character herself, the character in the way that you portrayed her, this essential, quintessential Baghdadi figure, and involved in this scenario. It's quite, I have to say, it's quite beautiful.
Well, you know,
I couldn't help but imagine in my mind what Murjana must have looked like.
Yeah. I mean, as I describe her, of course, she is an extremely beautiful young woman, and which is why the caliph is smitten. He's besotted with her because primarily her beauty, but as the story unravels, we understand she's an intelligent, sensitive woman who is called on to respond to a man like the caliph, who was Al-Ma'mun, a very complex, highly intelligent, highly educated, scholarly man. And this is a young girl, and she worked it out. So it's and I'm so glad you picked up on the personality of Murjana. She's a victim, but she's not a silly girl. Nothing could be further from the truth.
I have to say that whilst, I mean, obviously the focus on the characters and the drama being played out, that in itself was intriguing. But you managed also to capture the context, to capture the environment, to capture the scene. You know, the marketplace, the libraries, the courts of the Khalifa. So, I mean, I know or I hear that often some writers take quite a lot of time and energy in trying to set the scene for their drama. How did that work out for yourself?
Well, I was determined. I have to tell you, I was determined to try and draw in the reader into the atmosphere of the place, because I knew that the English-speaking readership, which clearly would form the majority, and would not necessarily be Arabs, they would know nothing about Baghdad, about that period in history. To them, it would be remote and highly obscure. So I did not want it to come across like that. I didn't want it to be exotic or a bit like the Arabian Nights, you know. Nothing in my writing points to that, I hope, because what I wanted was to create, as close as I could to the research, of course, with the picture that emerged to me from the research, as to invite the reader to sample the streets of Baghdad, the atmosphere as it might have been. Yeah. You know, the houses, the fountains, all the aspects of life in a great city. And it must have been a very great city.
Why did you write it in English?
Because, you know, I'll tell you, first of all, on a very practical level, I've spent nearly my whole life in England. Yeah. And my first language, I regret, is English.
Right. So it comes easier to you to express.
Much easier. Right. I find it very difficult to express these sorts of ideas in Arabic. But there's, of course, a much more important reason, which is that I want the English reader who has all these ideas I've already talked about of ignorance, superiority towards the Arabs, all these stereotypes, which are very, very unfair, that it is that reader who needs to be educated about Islamic civilization. I hope that the Arabic reader doesn't need that sort of education, although they might not know very much detail, you know, about the particular period, but that was why.
For the past century, probably 2 centuries even, the relationship between the West generally and the Arab world was dominated by the Orientalist approach, and which was written brilliantly from, you know, the late Edward Said, and then many followed in his footsteps. If we were to very black and white categorize this piece of work, this piece of literature, how would it fit within either the Orientalist narrative or what's been happening across the last 15, 20 years, and that is the decolonizing of knowledge and of resources and of history? Were you ever tempted to consider either or within the 5 years that it took you to write Murjana?
Yes. I certainly worked very hard, struggled so that it would never be seen as in any sense Orientalist. And hence my insistence to get away from the Arabian Nights. You know.
Yes.
But then I also, of course, the whole context is anti-colonial because it's trying to show a civilization which is admirable in its own right. Nothing to do with, no comparison with the West or any notions of Europe or any of that. No, indeed. So it's the second grouping that you mentioned is where this book fits.
And this whole movement, to decolonize, and by the way, I've done a couple of episodes with academics regarding decolonizing sources of knowledge and rewriting many episodes of history regarding Arabs, regarding Muslims, and that kind of relationship. In fact, the impact of Arabs and Muslims on Europe. I mean, I contend always that one of the biggest lies being perpetrated and unfortunately told time and time again by politicians and academics and thinkers alike is that Europe was built upon a Judeo-Christian heritage, which I personally believe is an absolute pile of poo. I believe that an entire era of the most influential time in creating modern Europe is being totally erased. And that is when the Arabs were ruling, the southern Spain and Andalus, which till today, tens of millions flock to every single year to visit. And also, when was Europe ever cozy with its Jewish elements? I mean, it was anti-Semitism was a European construct, and the pogroms and ultimately the Holocaust was perpetrated by Europe. So I always say this: from your perspective, and obviously you also being an intellectual and someone who's written on, yes, Palestine, but generally speaking on this relationship and dynamics between West and the Middle East or the Arab world generally, how important do you think this particular movement is right now?
Well, look, first of all, a word about Judeo-Christian. This is a complete construct.
Yeah.
And it was really built to try and support pro-Zionist sympathies.
Yeah.
Really, I think that's what it's really about. There is no Judeo-Christian anything. There is if you want to talk about how the Jews were influenced, and not the other way around, how they were influenced in Jewish history, one of the periods you would have to talk about would be the Islamic period,
Yeah.
which they operated in freely and were not only tolerated, they were regarded just like everybody else and in fact very often favored. So it's a nonsense, this Judeo-Christian. But you know, there is a word though of caution. We Arabs, and if you like Muslims in general, must try to get this right about our heritage, our legacy, neither to overdo it and become boastful and hyperbolic and the greatest this and the greatest that. We mustn't do that. But at the same time, we have to also avoid the traps set by a Western discourse, which is where there are aspects of life, customs, cultural happenings in the Arab Islamic world, which were indigenous to that part of the world. They were not, should not be seen through the opinions or guided by the opinions of Western travelers and Western explorers. But it goes deep, much deeper than people realize. They form all kinds of impressions, and they never pause to think, where have we got these from?
Yeah.
But in fact, they've got them. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is we need a sober, honest assessment on the part of the heirs of this civilization, an assessment of what that civilization actually amounted to. Neither to exaggerate it, nor to belittle it, to respect it for what it was as closely as we can.
What was Baghdad back then? What importance did it pose for the world? What kind of legacy did it leave for us today? I mean, if I was to tell my friends, my colleagues who come from Europe or North America about that particular period and how important it was, what would I tell them?
Well, you'd have to say that at the time, and the book, Murjana, is set in the middle of the 9th century AD, you'd have to say that at the time, and for 2 or 3 centuries, Baghdad was literally the capital of the world. It had no rival except possibly Constantinople, but really otherwise no serious rival. And the thing about it was that it was a center of learning, of culture, of architecture, of engineering. It's quite astonishing because of the position and the attitude of the caliphs and their brilliant court. They invited scholars from all over the world to come freely to talk about their ideas, their philosophy, their discoveries. This particular way of doing things is, I would say, unique, historically unique, that you have the capital of a ruling empire, which far from just sitting on its laurels and enjoying its triumphs, actually set out to invite scholars from all over to bring their learning, ilm in Arabic, to Baghdad from where it was disseminated. Now, it was disseminated, let me just say a quick word about the dissemination. Al-Ma'mun, by the way, had established something called Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, which was a translation academy. Really, that's what it was. In which manuscripts written in different languages, but very, very much predominantly Greek, were brought to Baghdad, were taken to the academy, and were translated into Arabic. The reason for that was that he was anxious that his people should read the wisdom of the ancients in their own language, so that there was no question that they could not have access to this knowledge. This is, I really think this is quite extraordinary.
Absolutely.
You know, and that in itself relates to the really Islamic view of knowledge. And that's very important. I wish we had time for me to expand, but let me just say quickly. You see, the Muslim attitude to knowledge is that knowledge belongs to God. It is created by God.
This is the divine.
Exactly. There's no copyright in Islam.
Absolutely.
So you don't have scholars who guard their secrets and, you know, won't let you know because they are the first discoverers of this. Not like that. It was a whole attitude promoted from the top that knowledge belongs to us all. God created for us. Just a question of who discovers it and can bring it and put it together. That's the attitude. You see, that's what dictated something like the House of Wisdom. It's what dictated the whole impetus to educate people. So that, because it was a gift from God, really. So I'm always very impressed by that. So therefore, more understanding of the way that this civilization operated would be, I think, very beneficial, and particularly to its heirs, who don't seem to actually understand very often, I'm sorry to say, don't really understand exactly what it did. Now, because of that, of course, that attitude, the way that learning was encouraged, the way that therefore that led to bookshops, madrasas. As you know, now that word has been used all over Pakistan, Afghanistan in different contexts. But it was really a school. And so the whole concept of receiving knowledge, imparting knowledge, was very essential to Islamic civilization. And as a result of that, Europe was the beneficiary, of course, because there was a great translation movement the other way, not from foreign languages into Arabic, but rather from Arabic into Latin, which took place in Spain in the 12th, 13th centuries. And that enabled the dissemination of all these books, all these creations of Arabic scholars to pass on to Europe. And note, I say the word Arabic and not Arab, because we really must be careful. We also have to understand, as I'm sure you know, many of the people who contributed to this glorious civilization were not Arabs.
Absolutely.
But why not? But so what?
Yeah.
They worked in a context of Islamic culture, and they spoke the lingua franca.
And Arabic was the language of knowledge.
Exactly.
Was the language of science.
Exactly.
I even read for someone a few years ago from here in either Oxford or one of the British academic institutions that at that particular time, no scholar worth his salt would be considered someone of high regard unless they learnt or knew or came into contact with Arabic language somehow.
Indeed.
And you know, it's fascinating that you describe that time and the importance of knowledge and the way that Islam regards how knowledge is divine, is of the divine, and that no one has. It's fascinating when you consider the fact that in all oppressive movements around the world, the very first thing that they decide to trample on is knowledge.
Indeed.
It's books. is
Indeed.
and that in itself is fascinating.
Yeah.
And that link between freedom and knowledge, and oppression and censorship is something which is quite fascinating.
Very good point. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. Okay. Of course, I mean, it goes without saying, I think that we are more or less in agreement that when, listening to that, when reading Murjana and going back, sort of losing myself in the alleyways of Baghdad and the Bayt al-Hikmah, House of Wisdom, I then come to see what Baghdad is today. And I think we're in agreement that it's an aberration to that particular memory, to that particular stature that it used to hold. But at the same time, this didn't happen in 2003. This was something that was an accumulation. And one could even say the same about Damascus, could say the same about Cairo, could say Tatwan, about, Al-Qayrawan, for instance. We could say the same about numerous cities that held realms of civilization at one point, that now you look at them, you go and visit remnants, you go and visit walls and doors and, engraved stones or the like, but really they do not reflect the standing of how they were. What did we do? Where did we go wrong? I mean, this is obviously something that is a sidetrack, but I think it's an important sidetrack. How did we get to where we are today?
Well, I tell you, part of it is ignorance of who we really were. Because if a people is to stand up on its 2 feet, obviously, history means that change is inevitable. And you get conquerors, and you get destruction, and things come and go. But if you want to think about rebuilding something of that glorious past, the first thing you have to do is know it. Yeah. Is you have to know your own culture, and know it not in the sense of vanity and silliness and boastfulness. No, you have to know actually what it was about. Once you understand it, it's like a sort of armor, and you know that you're supported, that you haven't come from nowhere. Yeah. You've come from something very great, and you will try your best to move on to something that is relatively successful, not by comparison to that very glorious past, but that's something that people are proud of or can stand. The sad thing is that colonialism has been so effective in smashing people's sense of themselves. Yeah. Never mind the smashing up of buildings and cities and structures, but actually it's led to a sort of loss of confidence on the part of colonized people who really internalized the degradation that was forced on them and started to feel that they weren't up to much anyway.
The destruction of history, the rewriting of history and the fabrication of history, that is surely one of the greatest crimes committed against people. Because you mentioned something quite interesting, and that is that we need to move away from, boasting about our lineage or our tribes or our, as honorable and noble and high and esteemed as they may be, but one would rather say, I come from people who invented this, or who created this, or had this kind of impact on the world. But even that, history doesn't really reflect the truth of where Baghdad used to stand, what kind of impact it had, not only on its surrounding regions, but on the entire world as was known back then.
Sure.
And in fact, how we even today, in terms of our sciences, our technology, our philosophy, our laws, our whole understanding of human interaction, whether we like it or not, we're reaching into history to grasp what we can from that kind of context.
No, indeed. But you see, if we go back again to what I've just said, which is the loss of confidence of colonized people, that's gone very, very deep. And so much so that if you look now at the vast wealth that has been the good fortune of certain countries in the Arab Middle East, and you look at that amount of wealth that appeared and should have been used in a different way. But what has happened, and I think that's inevitable, following on from my thing about colonized people, is that the impetus to use it in terms which are entirely Western, and use it for Western ends, and use it imitating Western civilization or Western culture. That's what's happened. So instead of, you might say to me, well, okay, well, what else? Well, I'll tell you what else, is why not look to Arabic history, our history, and look at structures, institutions which might be useful, which we can recreate with our money. Why are we imitating the West all the time? And so that's another, sadly, that's another problem in the whole history of colonization, that the colonized people very often aspire to become like the colonizers.
Yeah, and from what you're saying, it's quite clear that also the colonizers and sometimes and in various references are referred to as the conquerors, those who are dominant, those who are victorious in battle or confrontation or occupation or the like. Clearly, one of their most potent tools and weapons is history, is ridding that element from the self, so that basically one is deemed a shell with nothing.
No, exactly. And if I were to tell you that in my life I came across so many young Arab students doing PhDs, let's say, and very often the subject of the PhD was Napoleon's victory over Egypt, or whatever, or Aristotle's philosophy on such and such. Why not study our own extremely rich cultural history? And I want to sort of, in a way, leave our viewers with a thought, which is when you look at the system of government, and you will see that there has been attempts to try and imitate Western democracies, even though, of course, it hasn't worked, and you have dictatorships and so on. But these are Western models. Democracy is a Western model. So how about we look at the caliphate?
Nice.
And I'm being entirely serious. The caliphate lasted for centuries. Now, some things in it were obviously right, and they suited the people whom the caliphate ruled. What about looking at that as a model rather than looking at the West as a model?
One might be swayed to describe you as a radical. What's going on here? But no, what you're saying makes absolute sense. And maybe this movement to decolonize, to shift our gaze from everything that is Eurocentric, and which puts Europe at the very center of the world, even on the World Atlas, to looking at, the movement of civilizations, the movement of people, of nations, and maybe refocus on where we came from, on where many of what we do today and the systems that we behave by were influenced by all of that. That's very important. But, I can't escape the fact that this book has come out at a time of incredible angst for all of us. And that is what's happening in Gaza. Now, as I was reading the book, And as hard as I tried to escape the news, to escape the headlines, to escape the images, but I kept being drawn back. Somehow, and I don't know how to describe this, there was something, I don't know whether it was spiritual or whether it was something that it just was lingering in the back of my mind, that there is a connection, there is somehow a connection, that when you were writing about Baghdad in the late 9th century or the mid-9th century, and you were writing about Al-Ma'mun, you were writing about Murjana, you were writing about Baghdad, that somehow within you was the spirit of what was happening in the here and now, what was happening in Palestine. Even not only Palestine, in Iraq, post-2003.
Yeah, very much so. Because what added to my sadness about what's happening to the Palestinians was the thought that this crowd of vandals, calling themselves Israelis, are trampling underfoot a civilization they do not understand, they have no connection to, and thereby destroying not just physical life in Gaza and the West Bank, but destroying or trying to destroy a culture, a civilization, a history. Now, there was probably inside me a kind of rebellion, which is that they cannot destroy it. They will not destroy it because it's too great. It's too important in history to be destroyed by a bunch of thugs who come from all over the world and have only one idea in their head, which is to kill and to destroy. It cannot be. So even if you look back to the Mongol invasions, which of course happened in Baghdad and happened in other Arab areas, even the Mongols who are portrayed, I don't know how true this was to them, but they're portrayed as warriors and dangerous murderers and killers. They settled down, they learned, and they adopted the culture of the lands that they had conquered.
True. And they became part of that region.
They became part of it, they contributed to it, which is actually one of the very big lessons that one draws about Israel. Israel cannot contribute to the culture of the Arab world. It is not part of the Arab world. It does not wish to become part of the Arab world, and it will go in time, exactly as other invasions from outside. And of course, I'm thinking of the Crusaders. They will have to go because they don't fit in. And it's so interesting if you compare that to the Mongols, who came originally with the idea of grabbing and taking.
Pillaging, looting. But then they couldn't help.
They couldn't help it.
But stay and become part and parcel of the region.
Exactly, because they were still human somewhere. And they could understand a little in their own way that something very great had come across their paths, and they started to try to understand it.
I have to say that obviously reading Murjana, I was filled with glee and with joy because it's like, finally we have, a story here that we can celebrate. But in truth, and besides everything else, besides the knowledge, besides the ingenuity, there was an essential humanity in everything that was there. There was an essential humanity, and the point I constantly came back to in going to and fro, going back in my memory to that time of Baghdad and then coming back to today and seeing and observing what's happening in Baghdad today as well as neighboring Palestine. I couldn't help but think that, we built, we constructed. We were always advancing. We were always making things better. And today, and despite the advancement of the West, despite what we're having in terms of technology and innovation and communication and all that, yet it seems that we're only capable of destruction.
Yeah. Yes.
And that to me was something that kept lingering in my mind.
Yes, that's it's very good that you tell me that. I hadn't thought of it like that. But I am slightly surprised that you have not talked about the disease of love.
Of course.
In Arabic, مرض العشق.
Yes. That malady. I mean, it's obviously something that is inescapable.
Exactly. But I want to assure you, this is absolutely authentic.
Yeah.
I took those descriptions straight out of the Arabic medical textbooks, talking about love, al-ishq, as a disease, actually a disease of the brain.
Wow.
So, yes, indeed.
And we have, when we talk about, even in literature, in Arab literature, when we talk about Qais ibn al-Mulawah and his obsession with Layla, that he wrote, in ways that it was clear that he was ill.
Yes, he definitely had the disease. Yeah. He definitely, but sadly for him, Arabic medicine was not advanced enough at the time to come up with treatments and cures. Yeah. So, and this is one of the things that, of course, I touch on in the book. Yeah. But it's entirely authentic. I want to assure readers that there is nothing fanciful about these descriptions. Yeah. Strange as they might sound, it's all taken out of the medical textbooks.
Yeah. And how I mean, now in modern medicine, I mean, is that part of what we call alternative medicine, of herbal medicine? Where does that fit?
Not at all. It doesn't fit at all. It's if you, the closest you could say is something which people experience, which is, the best way I can describe it is to call it a passionate infatuation, where people fall in love, and then the object of their love is constantly on their mind. Yeah. They can't think of anything else. Anyway, when the person appears, their pulse rate beats faster. Things like that, which are in common experience. But there is nothing after I would say, the 18th, 19th centuries in Western medicine, which talks about the disease of love, and it certainly went into Western medicine, no doubt. Love sickness, sort of these maladies that English or other European doctors wrote about were taken from the Arabic, from the Arabic descriptions. Incredible. But it remains a bit of a mystery, really, as to how they looked at it in that sense. But there we are. That's what happened.
And I mean, since the book has come out, how has it been received?
To tell you the truth, I don't know. Because I do know at the personal level, people who've read it have been in touch with me to say very much things that you've said. That it's gripping, that they couldn't put it down, that they didn't, and quite a few English people said we didn't know any of this. So quite a few English people, first of all, said that they'd learnt a lot. They'd learnt a lot about the period, and they had no idea that's how Baghdad was, that's how the Islamic Empire was. But quite a few of them said that they'd learnt a lot, and that it had prompted them to go and look up some of the names of the towns that I've mentioned in the book. They looked them up geographically. And for example, Maru or Merv is in today's Central Asia.
Correct.
And not at all a part of Persia, a part of Iran, which of course it was at the time. And this kind of feedback, I can say this, I've had no negative feedback at all, no criticism. I don't know what that means. Maybe I did the right thing.
It means it's a great piece of work, and I have to say it's one of the most enjoyable, illuminating, enthralling pieces that I've read in recent times. So thank you, and many congratulations.
And thank you too. I hope our readers or our listeners will become readers as well.
Absolutely.